Before I start, I'd just like to say that my research couldn't have been done without the work of Philip Darbyshire, Carolyn Leach, and Daniel Vitkus, as well as the help of my mentor, Dr. Travis Sutton. Released in 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is commended for its positive representation of the mentally ill. Set in a mental institution, the film showcases a robust ensemble of characters with various disabilities. Its diversity even extends to the often unseen narrative of a Native American character, whose trauma directly stems from the racism he has endured. Avoiding the use of stigma, director Milos Forman instead invites his audience to appreciate the patient's personalities and ultimately sympathize with their pain. Unfortunately, this care for accurate and positive depictions fails to carry over to the female characters in the film. Only 3 notable women are seen on screen. One is villainized for her power, while the other 2 are treated purely as sexual objects. While the entire film contains sexist aspects, the contradictory treatment of the protagonist and antagonist is most striking. McMurphy, the rugged hero, is celebrated for his toxic masculinity. Conversely, the character of Nurse Ratched is portrayed as almost inhuman, a harsh warning against women in power. As seen by a thorough review of its characters, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest reinforces the dominant patriarchal ideology, creating a narrative that supports traditional gender roles. Randall McMurphy serves as both the film's lead and a representation of anti-establishment resistance. Fiery and quick-witted, his attacks against the ward's conformity quickly leads the audience to view him as a hero. However, the innate desire to celebrate McMurphy becomes disturbing when one recognizes the toxic masculinity that his character endorses. British scholar Carolyn Leach perfectly describes the paradox of McMurphy's relationship with the audience. He's the most exciting and entertaining character, yet he has been committed to the institution for raping a 15-year-old girl. His retelling of the crime to Dr. Spivey normalizes and justifies his violence. While McMurphy admits to the act, he insinuates that the 15-year-old consented. Claiming that no man could resist such a temptation, McMurphy renders himself blameless. This argument of boys will be boys is frequently used to justify such wrongdoings and ultimately perpetuates traditional gender roles. McMurphy is never cast in a critical light for his predatory actions, conveying to the audience that sexual aggression is normal male behavior. Having cemented McMurphy's machismo as admirable, the film then establishes his crusade against Nurse Ratched as heroic. McMurphy's constant acts of disobedience against Nurse Ratched are intended to be celebrated by the audience, framing him as a savior against the tyranny that is female power. Various interpretations of the film's themes have drawn a comparison between McMurphy and Jesus Christ. This parallel lends even greater significance to McMurphy's eventual sacrifice at the end of the film. After attempting to strangle Nurse Ratched, he is lobotomized and effectively rendered a vegetable. Chief Bromden then smothers McMurphy as an act of mercy. Instead of being framed as the suppression of a violent criminal, McMurphy's death transforms him into a martyr who delivers salvation to his fellow patients. By his hand, Nurse Ratched is rendered powerless, restoring the ward's masculinity. This is seen most clearly by the escape of Chief. Despite being given multiple chances of freedom, Chief was mentally unable to leave the institution until the patriarchal power structure was restored. With the reestablishment of the normal order, Nurse Ratched, and by extension any powerful woman, is ultimately depicted as the antithesis of freedom and righteousness. Nurse Ratched is a blatant and impersonal embodiment of oppression. Her character is flat and almost devoid of personality, molded to fit whichever loathsome female archetype the filmmakers wish to portray in any given scene. The 2 most striking roles Nurse Ratched embodies is the overbearing mother and the nagging wife. The first can be seen in her mother knows best attitude, which is conveyed in her strict schedules and her assertion that the voluntarily committed patients belong under her care. Nurse Ratched is also paralleled to Billy Bibbitt's own overprotective mother. The pair's detrimental smotherings is linked to Billy's stammer and extreme timidity around women. To fully express the supposedly unbearable hardship that is maternal control, the film culminates with the suicide of Billy, who would rather die than face his mother. While Nurse Ratched's metaphorical role of the emasculating wife does not have the same dramatic consequences, it is still an important aspect of the film. She is again linked to another patient's female oppressor, Harding's wife. During the group therapy sessions, the Hardings' strained relationship is the only topic Nurse Ratched discusses. Harding's sexual incompetence is blamed on his demanding wife, asserting that castration is inevitable under female control. Another parallel is drawn, as Nurse Ratched is also seen as having castrated her patients. The majority of the ward is not committed, but much like Chief, are too emasculated to leave. The film utilizes Nurse Ratched's appearance to illustrate her deviance from patriarchal standards. She wears little to no makeup, establishing her character as undesirable. Nurse Ratched's modest collar and long sleeves mark her as an unsexual being. Her attractive smiles are either forced niceties or triumphant smirks. Nurse Ratched's hair is the most obvious allusion to her evil. Parted in the middle and curled upwards, she sports her own pair of devil horns. The correlation between Nurse Ratched's appearance and her agreeability becomes obvious when analyzing the film's other female characters. Placed in opposition to Nurse Ratched are Candy and Rose. Named for their beauty and appeal, the pair of women are viewed only as sexual objects throughout the movie, establishing the proper role of women. Both are heavily made up and wear bright, attractive clothes. They are quick to smile flirtatiously. While Candy is McMurphy's girlfriend, she has no objection to being offered up by him to sleep with Billy. Rose is treated similarly, as her main function in the film is acting as sexual bait to distract orderly Turkle. Somehow even flatter characters than Nurse Ratched, Rose and Candy embody the film's reactionary misogyny, which would deny women any function other than that of a sexual trophy. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is defined by its memorable personalities. However, the contradictory treatment of the film's characters, based on their gender, leads it to resemble patriarchal propaganda. The film's protagonist is the primary torchbearer against women. McMurphy is celebrated for his toxic masculinity and is rewarded with a martyr-like status by the end of the film. Conversely, Nurse Ratched is used as a puppet to embody any undesirable traits a woman could possess, including power. The likable female characters are represented as submissive sexual objects, existing only to please men. The film utilizes physical appearance to convey a woman's worth, emphasizing its shallow view of women. It celebrates masculinity triumphing over strong women, and ultimately reinforces outdated cultural values. While One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is groundbreaking for the mentally ill community, it also exemplifies the archaic patriarchal ideology that is still present in film today. Any questions?
I have a question then.
All right.
Now I like your argument. I'm game for this, but I have to be convinced because I liked the movie. I thought it was fabulous, but then I saw it when I was, I don't know, 15.
Right.
I have a weird. Well, anyway, what now? When you yourself use a couple of descriptors to describe Nurse Ratched.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, devoid of personality, strict, hyperstructural, no decoration, contrived, emotive presentation, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Right. These things are almost a perfect representation of a Weberian structure. Right. Non-personalized structure that dominates. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Specifically the devoid of personality,
Right.
but incredibly efficacious. So much so that it is not avoidable. It's not resistible. Why make your argument?
Mm-hmm.
Why is the power of Nurse Ratched feminine power rather than just power? And specifically, you're claiming that it's feminine power.
Yes.
So you are drawing attention to the feminine quality here.
Mm-hmm.
If I was uncharitable, I'm not, but if I was, how would you defend yourself against the charge that it's you that's foisting the feminine onto Nurse Ratched and not the author?
Right. I haven't read the book myself, so I'm basing all this off of the movie. But throughout the film,
The book's better.
fair. Throughout the film, she's referred to over and over as like a domineering woman. The director and the screenwriter place the mantle of feminine, of woman onto her to show the audience that it is a feminine power that she represents.
You're saying that the director of the film did this?
I'm saying those involved in the storytelling of the film did this. So the director would be involved in this.
Okay, but what's your argument? I mean, you're asserting this, right?
Yes.
What's your evidence? Give me something to go
Evidence.
on.
Right. And this is off of how it's a feminine power.
Yeah. Well, specifically, if I was being uncharitable, I would say this is an avatar of power. Just
Right.
happens to be in the form of this very formidable woman. So how do you answer that charge?
Right. Her entire existence hinges on the fact that the story is portraying her as a powerful woman. She's connected to other feminine characters such as Harding's wife and Billy Bibbit's mother, and she's also put in stark contrast against other feminine characters such as Rose and Candy. So her identity is linked in a kind of feminine tyranny. She's depicted as a mother, as a nagging wife.
Okay, so contextually, you're arguing that contextually she is portrayed as a feminine character.
Yes.
Okay, all right. If Nurse Ratched was a man, would the story be different? Would the story be structurally different?
The story would be lacking of its kind of patriarchal tones. There would still be some present because of the treatment of the other women in this story. If the aspects of Harding talking about his nagging wife and Billy Bibbit's mother were still present, it would still be critical of feminine power, as well as the characters of Rose and Candy would still be seen as just sexual objects. But the large role that Nurse Ratched plays in kind of the patriarchal aspect of the movie would be taken out, but the story itself and its structure wouldn't really change.
Okay, all right, cool. That's a nice reading.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's been some time since I've seen this movie, but I remember liking it, and at the time it was groundbreaking, but I was always very uncomfortable with Nurse Ratched and how she related to Billy. And so when she started talking about how Nurse Ratched was put in the female position of being the nagging wife, the nagging mother, I was like, aha! So I was sold on the premises, and there was a lot of sort of accepted patriarchy back in the 70s anyway. We were accustomed to that way of thinking, so we might not have seen it back then like we would see it now. Like, it may seem glaringly obvious to students now, but not so much to us back then because it was a norm. Anyway, I liked your premise. You had me from the get-go.
Thank you. And to kind of speak on that, I'm not saying it's a bad movie. I enjoyed it when I watched it, and it kind of just shows that pieces of media, they're not black and white. Like I said, it was really groundbreaking for the mentally ill community, and it still is because it shows them as people, but it also has this large kind of patriarchal aspect. So it's not like a good or a bad thing. It's just, it has different sides to be analyzed.
Right, yeah. Good job.
Yeah, very good job. One of the cooler things, I always felt an affinity for this book because my father knew Ken Kesey and actually hated the guy. And Ken Kesey was a very, very strange guy. He participated in the CIA's LSD experiments. And he was a very, very unusual man. But I think I didn't know my father really well. I've only met him a few times, but one of the things that he made sure to tell me about was that he knew Ken Kesey. Specifically, he knew Ken Kesey's wife better than Ken Kesey, but that was his 15 minutes of fame, I think. And I had not read Ken Kesey up until that point, so I made it a point to go and read the book. Um, so I liked it a great deal. The book is better than the movie because there's a lot more going on in the book. But
And as I said, it's not a bad movie. I enjoyed it. It has good performances. It just has multiple themes.
yeah, excellent.
Hello. Yes. Hi. My name is Samanta Matamoros. Am I the person who's next? I thought I was third.
You are supposed to be third, but the second person has disappeared.
Oh.
So you're up.
Thank you. I would like to just piggyback on what you guys were saying, and I actually have seen the play of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I live in Brownsville, Texas. It's at the very southern tip of Texas, and our Camille Playhouse, our community theater, performed it a few years back, and one of my friends was in it as Billy, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful play to watch. I also know a little fun fact about the movie. Danny DeVito, who was in the movie, actually had to see a therapist while he was filming it because of the mental toll that it was taking on him. So just a fun fact about Cuckoo's Nest.
Cool.
But I am presenting over Miss Kiara Alegria Hughes. My mentor is Dr. Harris, and he is not here with us today because he is auditioning students for the Diary of Anne Frank for this fall. So that's why he couldn't join us today.
Are you still there?
Yes, sorry, I was muted for a second. Okay, sorry about that.
Sorry.
Let me get my presentation. Okay, so as I mentioned, I am going to be talking about...
Wait, do you have video?
I do not have video.
No, I'm just checking, making sure. No, that's fine.
There's an interesting background. Okay.
Cool.
I'm not sure how that happened, but okay. I don't know how to take it off.
No worries.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about Miss Kiara Alegria Hughes. Is anybody familiar with her work or her name here? No? So how many of you have heard of Hamilton, the musical? Yeah, so the person who created Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, he also wrote and starred in the Heights. So is anybody familiar with In the Heights? Okay, perfect. So Kiara Alegria Hughes actually wrote the book for In the Heights, which is something that if you're in theater, a lot of people know that, but a lot of people don't know that. So she actually has a background in music, and she studied music, and she did music for most of her life, but she always had a spark for writing. And so she became a little bit restless with being a musician, and so she wanted to spark some creativity back into her life, and so she started writing. And she began with the idea of Water by the Spoonful, which is the play that I'm focusing on in my research. And this play is a Pulitzer Prize award winner, Pulitzer Prize for Drama. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012. And Miss Kiara is one of the 15 women to have received this award. So very, very proud of her. Not that I know her personally, but still. And this play kind of became more than a single play. It became a trilogy. So she first published Eliot, A Soldier's Fugue in 2007, and the play was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for Drama, but it didn't receive the prize. From there, her trilogy was born, and in 2012, she published Water by the Spoonful, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Drama that year. And her work has been described as an imaginative play about the search for meaning by a returning Iraq War veteran working in a sandwich shop in his hometown of Philadelphia. So Water by the Spoonful is about a family who lives in Philadelphia, and the person whose story we follow is Elliot, who is a returning Iraq veteran. He was a Marine, and he is dealing with having killed an innocent man in the war, and then when he returns, his adoptive mother passes away. So he's dealing with the ghosts of his past and the ghosts of his present. And through the journey that we follow in Water by the Spoonful, he reconnects with his mother, his biological mother, who is a recovering drug addict. And she runs a chat room with other recovering drug addicts who she kind of helps stay in the recovery zone. So if they have a relapse, she is a mentor to them and a guidance to them. And so Elliot has a lot of resentment towards her because now she's seen as this kind of like a Mother Teresa figure, but in her past, when he was a child, she couldn't take care of him or his sister. And I actually directed a scene from Water by the Spoonful for Marjorie Hayes's directing class. So I would love to share a scene from this play. Would that be something that is possible?
Sure.
Okay. So this is scene 9 of Water by the Spoonful. And in this scene, we see the confrontation between Elliot and his mother, Odessa. Just a little bit of context. Odessa is meeting her friend John at a coffee shop, and they're talking about what they're going to do to get John back on track to leave drugs and focus on his family. So that's where we start off the scene, and then Elliot joins us with his cousin Yasmin, and then the confrontation happens. So let me try and see. I have it on my phone. How can I take off this background?
Go up to the little, are you using the app? Or are you using an online version?
I have the app on my computer.
There's a little video camera icon way up at the top.
Uh-huh.
Click on that.
Okay, and then settings?
Video settings, yeah.
Virtual background, none. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. That's better. Okay, so I have the video right here. Let me see if I can. Can everybody see it, kind of? Let's see.
Are you afraid your wife will find out that you're addicted to crack, or what came with your wedding vows? We just ordered.
I promised my son a science fair tomorrow. Something about dioramas and crazy glue.
Don't talk about them. Get sober for them.
Fuck you.
Leave me $3 for the coffee because I ain't got it. You picked up the phone and called me.
I don't know how to do this. I've never had to do this.
I have. It usually doesn't end up so well. 1 in 20 maybe guys actually stick around. Most guys just don't run with it. And then 30 days. And then you're wondering if... And sometimes you get your answer. Because their wife sees the site, logs on, and writes, "I found him face down in the snow."
How many do you want to do that?
7 years worth. On the good days, only once every hour. Do you want to be honest with your wife, or do you want to end up like me? That wasn't rhetorical.
I'm sorry, you're just not exactly what I want to be.
True. Now we're talking. There she is.
You're supposed to meet us at the flower shop.
The deposit is due at 9. My alarm clock didn't go off.
Were you up on that chat room all night?
Can I get a refill, please?
Where's the money?
I told you I ain't got no money.
And you think I do? I've been paying for Mommy Jane's meds for 6 months straight.
Get it from Yaz's. My mom already paid for the headstone. She got an expensive one. She's being cremated. She still needs a proper piece of Catholic granite. Right next to Abuela, right next to your dad and your sister and your brother.
And daughter.
Look, we all agree. No one asked my opinion.
Everyone who showed up to the family
I
meeting.
wasn't invited. I texted you twice. I was out of minutes.
We just spoke on the phone.
What you want me to do, Elliot? If I say I ain't got no fucking money, I ain't got no money.
Hi, I'm John. Nice to meet you.
Yes.
Are you one of Mom's rehab buddies? We, know each other from work. You scrubbed when?
I'm a practitioner of custodial arts.
Is she your sponsor? I thought you said this is a private meeting. I'm her son! He wasn't known. But I was raised by my Aunt Jane, and that particular aunt just died. So now you've got less than 2 hours to find some money to pay for one basket of flowers in the funeral of the woman who changed my pampers.
You both know I run out of minutes all the time. You couldn't be bothered to drive by and tell me face to face.
Because you always bothered to drive by and tell Mommy Judy hello when you knew she was sick. Because you bothered to hit me up one time this week and say, Elliot, I'm sorry your mom died.
You still got one mom alive.
Really? You want me to go there?
Guys, the flower place needs the money today. She was my sister, and you're my son too. Guys, $200 by the end of the business day. That's my rent.
Then 50.
I just spent 50 getting my phone turned back on.
$10 for the woman who raised your son. Do we hear $10 going
I
once?
spent my last 10 at the post office.
Going twice? Here's 50. No offense, but I don't take money from users. No, I don't. I'm not. That's like you believe.
Sit down. My son was just leaving.
Did World's Best Mom here tell you about her daughter?
I'm about to throw this coffee in your fucking face. Come on, Elliot. I'll pay for the flowers.
I've looked at that chapter once. The woman I saw there is literally not the same person I know. Do you want to know how she became such a saint? We all have our skeletons. Oh, well, she's an archaeological dig. Did she tell you about her daughter?
Go ahead. I ain't got no secrets. Excuse me.
Sit here and listen, Yaz. You were born with a silver spoon, and you need to know how it was for me.
Said I paid for the goddamn flowers, so let's go.
My sister and I had the stomach flu, right? For a whole day, we couldn't keep nothing down. Medicine, juice, anything we ate, it would come right back up.
3 days. You were vomiting for 3 days straight.
Your coworker here took us to Children's Hospital.
Jefferson.
It was wall-to-wall packed. Every kid in Philly had this bug. ERs were turning kids away. They gave us this little diagram about stomach flu and sent us home. Bright blue paper. Little cartoon diagrams. It said, give your kids a spoonful of water every 5 minutes.
Teaspoon.
A small enough amount that they could keep it down. 5 minutes, spoon. 5 minutes, spoon. I remember thinking, wow, this is it. Family time. Quality time. Just the 3 of us. Because it was gentle, the way you said, open up. I opened my mouth. You put that little spoon of water into my mouth. A little bit of relief. And then I watched you do the same thing to my little sister. And I remember being like, wow, I love you, Mom. My mom is all right. 5 minutes. Spoon. simple like that. You couldn't sit still like that. You had to have your thing. And that's where I stopped remembering.
I left.
A Department of Human Services report. That's my memory. 6 hours later, a neighbor kicks down the door. Me and my sister are lying in a pile of laundry. My shorts was all messed up. And what I really don't remember was my sister. Quote, female infant, approximately 2 years. Pamper and tear ducts dry. Likely cause of death, dehydration. Because when you dehydrate, you can't form a single tear. That's some funny up there.
Okay, and so that's why it's called Water by the Spoonful, because in this story, the mother was supposed to give her children a spoonful of water every 5 minutes to keep them hydrated. What's so interesting about Kiara and what I appreciate about her work is that she talks about things that are relevant to the lives of everyone, people, regardless of what your socioeconomic status is, what your nationality is. All of her work can resonate with all of her audiences, whether you relate to the family dynamics or to just things that happen in family life that people don't really like to talk about. And that's something that I've noticed is a trend with artists and playwrights who receive Pulitzer Prizes. Let me pull up the information that I had here. Where is it? One second. Here. Oh, yes. Okay. So, like I mentioned, Kiara won the Pulitzer in 2012. And one of her big themes is talking about things that families don't really like to talk about, talking about just everyday experiences that families like to conceal. And then if we go back a few years to 1999, Margaret Edson wrote Wit, and that's the year that she got the Pulitzer Prize for Drama Award. And if you're not familiar with Wit, it deals with the story of a woman who has cancer and how she travels through that journey and kind of accepts that, you know, this is something that's going to greatly affect her life. So again, this is something that many Americans can relate to, but don't like to talk about. So most of us know someone who has died of cancer or who has had cancer and survived, but it's something that we don't like to talk about in our everyday lives. It's not something that we address frequently. And then the year before that, Paula Vogel, who wrote How I Learned to Drive in 1998, received the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. And that story follows the life of a woman who kind of has to come to terms with her sexually abusive relationship with her uncle when she was a teenager. So again, that is something that does happen to people, but it is also something that families don't really like to talk about. So I am very glad that Kiara had a way of addressing this family dynamic and the story of a veteran and how he deals with PTSD from being in Iraq, and how he deals with recovering and healing from his traumatic childhood, because there are a lot of families who do experience traumatic events, and then it's hard for those families to heal their trauma and come to terms with what's happened to them. But when we see our life on stage, when we see what is happening in our everyday life on stage, it kind of gives us a form of catharsis and a form of belonging. And that's something that I truly appreciate about the theater, that it is the story of life on stage, and it has something for everyone. And that is my presentation on Kiara Alegria Hughes. Does anybody have any questions or comments for me?
Lorenzo, hi Samantha, how you doing? And just a quick question, and perhaps as you kind of gave a sort of an overview of Kiara's work on Water by the Spoonful, but I'm curious as to what exactly about that particular play drew you to that one, as opposed to her other plays that formed that particular part of that trilogy. So Just curious.
Yes. Honestly, I was exposed to this play in high school. My high school director directed it when I was in high school, and I was the stage manager for it. So I already knew about this work when I started doing this research with Dr. Harris. And then I saw the first part of the trilogy, Elliot, A Soldier's Fugue in Houston, and I've also read The Happiest Song Plays Last. So I've read the first part, read and seen the second part of the trilogy, and read the last part of the trilogy. And the reason why I chose to talk more about the Water by the Spoonful, the middle portion of the trilogy, is because, again, this was one of her most known works. This was the play that got the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. I have a personal connection to it because I have stage managed it. And to me, this was kind of the meat and the heart of the story. So in the first part of the trilogy, we get to know the characters and get to know their background. The second part of the story is more of the climax, and then the third part of the trilogy is when we find out what happens to the characters after they've kind of made amends with themselves and with each other.
I'm curious about how you sort of position the play in terms of that many Americans can relate to it, and though we know that this particular play also resonates with Latinx theater, right? Or you can position within Latinx theater, right? So the idea that perhaps Latinx theater is American theater, of course, right? And so how we might expand the narrative in terms of Latinx theater and American theater, right? So how do you see this particular play expanding the narrative of America?
So especially in TYA and in high school is when most students are exposed to theater. There are a lot of rules and that theater has to follow in order to cater to parents and to students. You know, we kind of have to play it safe in theater in order to be heard. But what I appreciate about Kara's work is that she chose not to play it safe. She chose to talk about themes that are very strong, themes such as the death of a child, overcoming PTSD, overcoming drug addiction, and then things that everybody can resonate with, such as reconnecting with family, making amends with your family, making amends with yourself, having grace with yourself and others. Those are all things that the general audience can relate to. And I do think that Kiara is doing a great job of expanding Latinx theater because again, the family is Puerto Rican and they live in Philadelphia, and they expose their culture in the play. And when you talk about if you watch the rest of the play, there is a lot of Latin music in there. There is a lot of just community, a strong sense of community in the play. So on top of exposing what America tries to conceal within family life, she is also giving Latin American families a platform to be heard on stage and to be seen on stage, and gives the audience a moment to resonate, gives Latin American audience a moment to resonate with their culture on stage.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Garcia.
It's an interesting, the only reason I know about this play is because it has to do with a Marine returning from conflict. Now, by the time this play came along, I had already sufficiently recovered from being a Marine that it didn't immediately get placed on my radar. It was years before I heard about it from other Marines. So I'm wondering if there are two ways to think about this. There's a trend in American performative art to zero in on trauma and human misery, actually human horror, and use it as a kind of marquee to draw audiences. A kind of weird kind of pornography, in a sense, of violence, of horror. Now, I'm a little skeptical about this, but I've heard people talk about it. On the other hand, there's this overabundance of Americans starting to talk about moral injury. Soldiers suffering from moral injury, and they start to mention it in terms of PTSD, and basically it's an attempt to struggle with something that they really don't have any good way to deal with, other than a peculiar medicalization of PTSD. Now, at the same time, you have people starting to say that being poor in America is starting to achieve the status of an environment in which one can easily suffer moral injury, because it's a tantamount to a kind of torture. Have you heard of any of this kind of discussion, and do you see this piece of art fitting in anywhere there?
I have not heard of Kiara's work being having references of moral injury. I have heard, though, I'm not sure if you're aware that theaters have recently written and exposed work on concentration camps, like detention centers, not concentration camps, detention centers. So in Dallas specifically, I believe it was Kitchen Dog Theater who collaborated with another theater in Dallas to bring about crossing lines. That's what the work was called. And it revolved around the life of people living in detention centers. Carmia Theater also wrote, it was called Ursula, or Letting Yourself Go with the Wind, written by Frida Espinosa. And that play was about a little girl from El Salvador who crossed through Mexico, rode on this train, very famous, called the Beast, that people use to cross through Mexico into Texas. And this little girl was detained and taken away from her mother. And it's her life in this detention center. And so it's great that people are talking about these traumatic experiences that are happening to people, and that they're bringing light to this. But a lot of the time, that's as far as it goes. Theaters will talk about it and people will be aware of these current events, but there is no further action. So one of my friends told me that she believes this kind of narrative in theater is kind of, she called it something similar to what you said. She called it, I can't remember what she called it, but it basically meant that people like to feel bad, but then they don't like to work towards finding a solution for this problem. So what she specifically does is she works with local government to provide legal aid to undocumented workers, and she acts as a translator for lawyers working with undocumented people. And she would much rather be proactive about what's going on instead of going to watch a piece about these traumatic experiences that are happening. So that's the only moral injury that I can think of in theater, but I don't believe that that was Kiara's intention with this work. I do believe that her intention was to bring families together and to give, to stand in solidarity with people who go through drug addiction, or people who have broken ties with their families for personal reasons. And actually, this Water by the Spoonful, this story, the whole trilogy was inspired by people in her own family. She interviewed her cousin Elliot, who inspired Elliot, the soldier, in this story. And she interviewed other family members who inspired these characters, such as Odessa, the drug addiction recovering mother, and all these other characters. And when her family member who inspired Odessa saw this production, Kiara was very nervous that it was going to offend her family member or bring about really bad memories, but instead this family member was really grateful and just thankful for the representation of people like her who are recovering, and instead of being demonized, are kind of being accepted more and more in society, and what's the term? Kind of finding redemption.
Well, thank you very much. That was a good response. Thank you everyone for coming.